Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on calculating emissions from purchased goods and services. We're really excited to be discussing what is likely a very critical source of emissions for many of you. And we'll also discuss our feature set that has just been rolled out for calculating such emissions. So just an overview of what we'll discuss today. We'll talk a little bit of background on purchased goods and services and capital goods. What are these emissions? Why are they important? How do we estimate them? And then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jasmine, who will run us through a demo of our application and the feature set that we have to support calculating emissions from them. Just a reminder, we have a Q&A button. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them along, and we'll do a little Q&A at the end if we have time. I'm Nick Sontag, Senior Manager for Sustainability here at Sustain.Life. I develop a lot of the tools and calculations that go into our application, including the one you'll see today. And I'm joined by Jasmine Zhuang. Jasmine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine. I'm the head of product here at Sustain.Life. That means I'm responsible for partnering with our design, engineering, and sustainability teams to build out all of the features and functionality that you see in the application. So thank you for coming.
Great, thank you. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I want to set down some definitions for what we're talking about today. If you've done any greenhouse gas accounting, you've probably seen this diagram on your screen. This is the greenhouse gas protocol's value chain diagram. Some of this is going to be review for some of you, but the greenhouse gas protocol is split into 3 different scopes. Scope 1 is greenhouse gases that my organization directly emits, whether that's through the combustion of fossil fuels or the release of something like refrigerants. Scope 2 are indirect emissions that are the result of energy that we're purchasing. So mainly with Scope 2, we're talking about the emissions from the electricity we purchase. And then Scope 3 are indirect emissions from everything else in our value chain. And so if looking at this diagram, you can see that Scope 3 has quite a few categories in it, and it's split between upstream and downstream. Upstream is really like the supplier side, you can think of it that way, and downstream is the customer side. And the 2 categories of emissions that we're talking about today are purchased goods and services and capital goods. And those are on the upstream Scope 3 side. Purchased goods and services refers to tangible goods and intangible services that our organization purchases. They run the gamut from raw materials that we might be buying to incorporate into our products, so production-related inputs, to finished goods that we might be buying to help manufacture our products or to use in our administrative offices. On the services side, we have things like we might have a website and we're paying for web hosting services, or we might have a marketing firm that we're working with to fine-tune our marketing strategy. Those would be services we'd need to calculate our emissions for. And then capital goods, which is a separate category, but very related, where we're basically pulling out the extended life goods that we use to manufacture a product or deliver a product or service. So very commonly, this includes things like vehicles or machinery, manufacturing equipment, things like that. And when we're talking about the emissions from these categories, what we're talking about is the supply chain emissions up until the point that we are acquiring the good or the services being delivered to us. This is also known as the cradle to gate emissions. So just to run through an example, let's say I'm an apparel company and I manufacture and design our clothing in-house. I might be buying raw materials like fabric to incorporate into our clothing. That would be a purchased good. I might be buying things like computers for our designers to design our clothing on. I'm probably buying some software, some design software to go on those computers. I probably have a website to sell my products. And then for capital goods, I probably have some machinery to actually assemble and fabricate the clothing. And in terms of the cradle to gate emissions, for fabric, I need to go all the way back to the growth of, let's say, cotton, if it's a cotton fabric, the all the agricultural inputs that go into that, the harvesting of the cotton, the spinning of it and production of fabric, the dyeing of it, all the way up until when I acquired the fabric. And that includes transportation at all those steps, except for the step between my supplier and me, which is a different category. So you can imagine there are many layers along the supply chain for which we have to account for the emissions. And then I do want to mention there are a couple exclusions from these categories. Basically, any purchase good or service that already has its own accounting category is excluded from purchase goods and services and capital goods. So for example, business travel, if I'm taking a flight, that would be a service, but we don't account for it in purchase goods and services because business travel, as you can see on the screen, is already its own category. Another example would be fossil fuels, which are in a way a purchase good, but we're already accounting for the combustion of fossil fuels under scope 1 and the supply chain emissions of those fossil fuels under a different scope 3 category, fuel and energy related activities, which you can see on the screen. So I hope that sets the stage for the types of emissions that we're going to be discussing today. I want to talk a little bit about why do we need to calculate emissions for these? Why are they so important? And part of it comes down to all of those layers in the supply chain that I was talking about. Those layers add up very quickly when you consider all of the things that you are buying. We're basically talking about the embodied carbon of nearly everything that your organization purchases. Based on reported data, we know that on average, these two categories together, purchase goods and services and capital goods, are 6 to 7 times larger than an organization's scope 1 and 2 emissions. For many organizations, purchase goods and services will be the single largest source of emissions for them. So this is a big deal. 68% of companies that reported to the CDP reported that purchase goods and services was the most relevant emissions category for them. So it's really important because it's really big and it's a big source of our emissions. It's also really important because these emissions occur at the intersection of our spending, our procurement, purchasing behaviors, and our environmental footprint. So being able to overlay carbon information on our purchasing behaviors can lead to really actionable insights, can lead to how we want to run RFPs, can lead to decisions on supplier selection, can lead to decisions on product or material substitutions, and perhaps most importantly, can uncover synergies between carbon and cost reduction. So there's a lot of wealth of information and data that's sort of contained in this procurement data when we can start to connect it to emissions. So here we have a chart. This is actually from the CDP, where they actually modeled scope 3 emissions for tens of thousands of companies. And their conclusion was that nearly all of scope 3 emissions occur in one of two categories: purchase goods and services, or use of sold products, which we see in blue here. So again, a big source of many organizations' emissions. What's the challenge though? The challenge is that these emissions are really difficult to measure because of all of those steps in the supply chain. Ideally, we want to be obtaining this emissions data from our suppliers directly. Nothing beats primary data, but doing so and engaging with our suppliers can be a very slow, years-long process. If our suppliers haven't performed a greenhouse gas inventory, or they haven't performed a life cycle analysis of the products they're selling to us, then we need to be successful in pressuring them to do those things. And then that takes time, and then they'll have to come back and report that to us. So we're talking about something that can span years for some suppliers. So we need to make a way to be able to support those supplier engagement efforts to make them effective, because it's so time consuming and it uses a lot of our resources. Second, analyzing purchasing behaviors requires a lot of data. Procurement data sets can span thousands to hundreds of thousands of transactions annually. They're unwieldy to work with, and the second you take them out of your accounting software, they can be very computationally expensive to work on. It's not necessarily something that you can just plop into Excel. And I speak very much from experience here because previously worked for a company that had billions of dollars in annual expenditures and was tasked with calculating these emissions from scratch. I had, Excel and some basic coding at my disposal, and this was a months-long process. It wasn't just about the size of the data that I was working with. It was also about the functionality that I needed to categorize our transactions into the right commodities, and then to sort that into the right emissions categories. It's not something that Excel is well suited for. And that's where we come in. The feature set that you'll see momentarily addresses these issues by providing you an easy to use, simplified tool for processing, grouping, and categorizing your purchases. Like I said before, ultimately, the best way to calculate purchase goods and services emissions and capital good emissions is to engage with your suppliers to get primary data. This tool is a springboard for doing just that. It uses a spend-based approach, which means that we calculate emissions based on how much you spent on different commodities. And that approach gives you two things. First, it gives you an immediately reportable emissions number for your purchase goods and services and your capital goods, much faster than individually engaging suppliers. And second, and most importantly, it gives you the emissions insights so that when you get to step 2 to engage with your suppliers, you can already identify who are the critical suppliers I need to engage with? Who should I prioritize first? Who are the largest contributors to my scope 3 emissions? So that you know that when you're spending your time, going back and forth with them, obtaining the data you need or conveying what you need from them, that when you get it back, you're actually addressing big sources of emissions. And in the meantime, while you're going through that process, you have a number that you can already report to your stakeholders. And that number is only going to get more accurate over time as you bring in more data from your suppliers. Just some background on methodology. This approach is greenhouse gas protocol aligned. It's centered around established economic data that's published by the US EPA. So this data details emissions per dollar revenue for every industry and commodity in the economy. Once you categorize your spending into these different commodities, we adjust for inflation, and then we apply the factors to calculate emissions. The math behind this is actually quite simple. The math isn't the problem. If the math was the problem, then you could do this in Excel. The problem is the process of grouping and categorizing your spending data, which requires a tool specifically designed for that. And that's what this feature set addresses. So I'll hand it over to Jasmine now to give you a little tour of what we've developed.
Thanks, Nick. All right. I'll now walk through how this feature set works within the Sustain.Life platform. As a reminder, Sustain.Life helps you measure, manage, and report your environmental impact, including your emissions, including from your purchase goods and services. So once you're in the app, in order to get to this new functionality, you can click Measure and then go into Purchases. Again, this covers 2 greenhouse gas protocol categories, one being purchase goods and services and one being capital goods. When you get to this landing page, you'll see a few things. You'll see any data from prior runs of this calculator, as well as a summary of all of your prior runs. I'm going to show you how to start a new entry. You just have to click the upload button here. From here, if you need help, you can download a template from Sustain.Life, or you can simply download data directly out of your accounting platform. It represents individual transactions, say for your fiscal year. So if I wanted to upload data out of my accounting platform from the year 2021, all I have to do is download it out of that external platform and rename a few columns to match what's expected in the Sustain.Life platform. I've already done that here. So I'm just going to select a file representing my spend from 2021. From there, this is just a quick preview, but I'll show you what types of data are required within your upload. All we need is the transaction date, the category of your spend. This is your internal name, so whatever your company and organization, however they categorize it, the more granular this is, the more accurate our emissions calculation will be. So we encourage you to try to find the most granular subcategory of data that you can map into a standard category on our side. You just need the transaction amount, and then vendor is optional, but it helps us provide you data at the end to help you identify your highest emitting vendors, from which you can then use as a jumping off point to assess more deeply. So this is just a review screen, and you can continue on to the next step. For me, I've already done a prior run, and you can see that our system has saved all of the mappings from any previous entries. So that's a great thing about our tool. Once you've done this mapping step once, you really shouldn't need to do much additional work unless your categorization has changed. But I'm just going to point out a few things on this step. This is really the crux of where you'll have to spend your time. But again, we save these mappings for you the next time you come in. So at the simplest level, we group all of your transactions into your high-level categories, ordered by top spend to least. So we encourage you to start with your highest spend categories and move through until you've mapped at least 75% of your spend. That way, you don't have to map all of your categories, especially if there's a long tail. If there's anything that is missing, we'll extrapolate it for you, and I'll explain that a little bit after. So in terms of what you need to map, you first choose whether it's a good or service. So for example, for travel and hospitality, I'll choose services. And then this is already showing all of the potential options under services. These map to the EEIO categories that Nick mentioned that are part of the EPA standard set. These each have different emissions factors, which are what we then apply to the amount of spend that you have. So in this case, I'll look through and see what's relevant to travel and hospitality. I can also type ahead if I know that these are hotels and choose my category from there. A few other things to call out. Under goods, you can specify the type, whether it's general, capital goods, or production related. And this helps you categorize your emissions correctly, as well as get the accurate emissions factor. And I'll just hand it over to Nick quickly to go into a little bit more context for what that means for your purchases.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the start, we're talking about two sources of emissions, purchase goods and services and capital goods. So this is where we separate out the capital goods in this type dropdown. And then you'll also notice we have a third option here, which is production related. And we have that there for a couple reasons. First, you may want to track the emissions of your production related inputs, things like, fabric, if you're an apparel maker or something like that. You may want to track those emissions separately. And also it helps us get to a slightly more accurate emissions number, because if you're buying production related inputs, you're probably buying them at wholesale prices. You're not buying them, you're not going to, the fabric store and buying it at retail prices. Because it's a spend-based analysis, having an idea of how much you're spending or whether you're paying for that margin can greatly impact the emissions. So by allowing you to specify this, we can kind of adjust for that to get to a more accurate number.
Thanks, Nick. A few other things to call out that make this tool very helpful to help streamline this process. One is the exclusions that Nick mentioned earlier. There are certain types of spending that shouldn't be included in your purchase goods and services or capital goods emissions. For example, if I have a facilities and fleet category of my transactions, and I select that this is actually my rail transportation, you'll get a warning message that transportation is excluded from this category and should actually be entered into a different category with our app. You can always choose to ignore it, but we suggest that you take our suggestion and you can exclude it. That excludes it entirely from this calculation, and you don't have to worry about cleaning up the data on your own. It will also save that for next time you come in, so it will automatically be excluded. So from here, I see that I've already categorized over 75% of my spend. You'll see that you can leave a few of these blank, so I don't have to categorize 100% of my spend. What we do here is pretty unique and more accurate. So we'll take your spending patterns as a company or organization, calculate an average emissions factors based on your personal spending habits, and then extrapolate that to any unmapped categories. So that way you don't have to worry about categorizing all of your spend, especially if you have hundreds of categories, but you can rest assured that your emissions number at the end will be more accurate than if we used a catch-all average factor. And then from here, this is just showing you a preview. So you'll see every single transaction in your upload is now mapped to a standard emissions category that maps to the EIO categories. And then from there, you can finish and calculate. In the back end, we'll be looking up those emissions factors, applying them to the proper transactions, and then calculating your total emissions. I'm just going to show you a prior run that I have. So you'll see we saved your progress here if you want to come back to it. The great thing about that is that you can do this work in chunks. If you need to get feedback from stakeholders, or if you want to split it with teammates, you can do that. Don't have to worry about getting it all done in one go. From here, you can now drill down into a few different things. One is you can see a summary of your total spend, emissions, and then your top categories. So this gives you a great summary of your top emitting categories. And then if you want, you can drill in for a complete view of all of your categories. We also have a more granular drill down. So from here, you can click into your 2021 entry and actually view all of your individual transactions with their associated emissions. From here, there's a few exploratory things you can do. You can sort and filter. You can look at certain vendors. So for example, if you want to look at all of the transactions associated with a vendor or supplier, you can filter it that way. So this gives you some high-level views with which you can start analyzing your data. And then I'm just going to go over to a more detailed exploratory view that you can use to really cut your data in a bunch of different ways. So from the reporting tab, you can get to the purchases report. This allows you to cut your data in a few more ways. So some of this is the same data that you just saw. So your total emissions, the total spend that represents, and the total vendors. From here, this category view helps you identify your top emitting vendors, or top emitting categories. So for example, travel and hospitality contributes the most to my emissions. This vendor view is also extremely helpful. From here, you can view your top vendors by emissions. So for example, for me, my top vendor in terms of emissions is Marriott. What I would probably do from here is identify the top vendors I then want to engage further with. So let's say I select the top 5. I can then use Sustain.Life's supplier assessment to submit a request for further sustainability data. And what that allows me to do is get actual data from my suppliers on real emissions. And then I can use that to determine how I want to work with them on initiatives to reduce emissions going forward. And I can also use these to assess new suppliers in categories that are emissions intensive. Just show a few more things. This allows you to see the breakdown of emissions by category. And the great thing here is that you can view either in terms of your internal language. So say you're presenting this to internal stakeholders that only understand the category coming out of your own accounting platform. So this allows you to speak the same language as the rest of your company. And then this shows you how we've categorized it in a more standard way. So if you want to report externally, these are industry standard names, again, coming from the EEIO dataset. As you get more and more data, you can look at time series data as well. So I have a year's worth of data, so I can see how my spending patterns differ by month and what that means in terms of resulting emissions by category. If I were to do this for multiple years, you can also see a year breakdown. Right now, I just have 2021. And then the last thing to point out is that sometimes you might want to export this data so that you can explore it even further or put together materials specific to your company. So from here, this contains all of your transactions, the spend, the different categories, the vendor, and the resulting emissions. From here, you can just export it as an Excel, and you can import it into whatever system you use to create BI reports. So I just want to bring this back to the context of where this lies in our app as well. So your purchase goods and services and capital goods emissions are part of your scope 3 emissions. So when you come back to the main landing page of our platform, you can see where purchases falls in terms of your overall scope 1, 2, 3 inventory. You can report it as part of scope 3. And again, once you're ready, you can move on to the management aspect of actually reducing those emissions by creating those initiatives with your suppliers. So that is a run through of how the feature set works in the platform. This is available to all of Sustain.Life's premium and enterprise customers. So we hope this will help you streamline and make this process a lot less onerous and easier to calculate these emissions for your company.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. I think we have a lot of really good questions that we want to get to. So let me see here. We'll just start at the top. So Amelia asks, can you talk more about the reported data? What data is this? I think they're referring to the data where I said 6 to 7 times, or purchase goods and services and capital goods are 6 to 7 times greater than scope 1 and 2 emissions. That's actually from the CDP. So the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a global reporting agency that thousands of companies report their emissions to. So based on specifically their 2019 data set. Hope that answers your question. One question here we have is, as a supplier of knowledge, how can we provide reasonable data to our customers requesting this information of us? If you're a supplier and you're trying to provide data to your customers on the emissions of either the goods or services or knowledge, so to speak, of what you're providing them, there are a few different ways to perform that. What we're really talking about is how you are allocating emissions to your customers. There are some established frameworks for how to do that. You know, one way, for example, is to take if you've done a full inventory of scope 1, 2, and 3, you could prorate it by your revenue and then multiply it by the revenue from each customer. This is there's kind of a hierarchy on how you want to do it. That's probably lower on the hierarchy because you're prorating by revenue. Another way you could do it is by conducting a life cycle analysis of the given product or service. And then, then you'll have, emissions per unit of product that you're providing, and you can multiply that by how much each customer is purchasing. So those are the two of the ways to allocate emissions. Adam asks, where's the boundary between the reporting company's scope 3 purchased goods and services and a supplier's downstream scope 3 use and end of life emissions? Maybe I'll bring it back to the diagram for this. So Adam is asking about purchased goods and services relative to these downstream categories, use of sold products, and end-of-life treatment of sold products. So just some background. Purchased goods and services, as I said, that's the emissions of everything until you acquire the good. The use of sold products is the emissions from all of the products that you have sold and your customers' emissions. So as an example, if you're a vehicle maker, you're a car maker, your use of sold products is generally pretty high because cars have high emissions because they're burning fossil fuels. Then the end-of-life treatment of sold products is the emissions from when cars are disposed of. These are all part of your inventory. So what is the boundary? The boundary is really my office door or my factory gate, essentially when I acquire it. If I were to add together the purchased goods and services emissions for a particular product, plus the use of sold products emissions, plus the end-of-life treatment of sold products emissions, what I would have is the full life cycle emissions of that product. And the boundary is when the customer obtains it, and then when the customer disposes of it. So I hope that answers your question. Let's see. Adith asks, can the tool be directly connected to RDBMS or compatible only with Excel? I'm going to assume that's accounting software. Jasmine, are you familiar?
Relational database. I can answer that one.
Sure.
So we're trying to streamline this process as much as possible for you. So right now, it's probably the easiest thing to do is just download data directly out of your accounting system and upload it into our system. We're actively working on an integration that will make this a little bit simpler and cut out at least that data entry step. So depending on where your data is, we could pull that in. If it's in an accounting platform, we're working on a spend integration that would pull that data in on some specified cadence. So if at the end of every quarter or at the end of every year, you want us to refresh your source data, all you then have to do is either come in and do your mappings for the first time for your categories, or just verify that the mappings you already entered in the past are correct. So that will cut out that first step. But for now, what our application supports is the Excel upload.
Great, thanks. Alex asks, is the 75% spend categorization requirement from the greenhouse gas protocol? It's not. I think it would probably be beneficial to go into a little more detail here. We really are categorizing and calculating emissions for 100% of your spend. By having the sort of 75% threshold, what we're basically saying is the last 25%, we're going to apply a more generic emissions factor for. And this is consistent with the greenhouse gas protocol. We're going a step more accurate, as Jasmine mentioned in the demo, in that we're not just using a generic factor, we're actually developing a factor based on your purchasing habits. So it is going to be more reflective of your actual behaviors as an organization. You can certainly go beyond 75% and go to 100%. It's going to give you an even more accurate number. Part of this is just to save users time, because as you start to categorize the smaller categories with less and less spending, the sort of marginal benefit decreases in terms of accuracy. So 75% is generally a good place to draw the line. Aaron asks, can you speak a bit more about the EPA spend data set? For example, do the emissions factors include all embedded upstream and downstream emissions of the good and service? Yeah, I think we've got a few questions about this data set, actually. So this is EPA's EEIO data set. So if you Google that, you'll get some responses. It stands for Environmentally Extended Input-Output Model. Basically what it is they've modeled the flow of value through the US economy. So basically the flow of money in terms of all of our supply chain. So in the apparel example, the agricultural part of growing cotton to developing it into fabric, to clothing makers, to apparel fabricators, et cetera, et cetera. And then by overlaying carbon information on that, they can develop, emissions factors that are emissions per dollar spend. I'm just reading the rest of this question. So yes, they do include all of the embedded upstream emissions, but not the downstream emissions. So if you're in the data set, there will be, for example, a commodity for fabricated aluminum products. That's going to include all of the upstream emissions to create, a aluminum pipe fitting, for example. It won't include the downstream because it's calculating the emissions for when you purchase it, how much is the embodied carbon of that product. Similar question here, can you apply emissions organizations in any country? So I think they're asking about the international applicability of this data set. So it is a data set that is based on the US economy. It is actually somewhat common for international organizations to use the US data set as representative and as a proxy for other countries, and that's just because of the lack of data. We are actually working on for the next version of this tool to include international emission factors. So you could specify where a certain product is coming from, or if you have a location in another country, we can use a country-specific factor that reflects the economy there. And it's the same modeling that's been done, but internationally. Nadav asks, can you edit the data once it's been uploaded and calculated? This is something, Jasmine, remind me, this is something we're working on, right?
Yeah, there's really only two things that can change with your data. One is the source of your raw data, so the actual transactions, if you realize there are some mistakes or you didn't include everything, and then the category mappings. So what you would do in this case is just if you've completed a run that you want to discard, you delete that run and then you can just start over. So re-upload your raw data set if there are any changes, and then either confirm the mapping if there's nothing that's changed, or implement your new mapping. So that's how you would do it in the system.
Great. And yeah, I'll just cover, as I mentioned during the presentation, the most important part is to get this number, to get this initial emissions number, then use that information to go to your suppliers and get data. And then the next version of this tool will have a way for you to, okay, automatically, we've gotten data from our suppliers. Now it's going to automatically update my inventory. So it's going to be overriding my emissions. So that's ultimately the goal, so that our emissions estimate becomes more accurate over time. Let's see here. I'm just scrolling down. Okay, we have a question on here basically about the differences in emissions calculations across different softwares. So would other software companies calculate the emissions with the same emissions factor as Sustain.Life? For example, if we buy 1 ton of cotton fabric, you calculate the emissions. Would another software company calculate the same amount or a different amount? Is there an industry standard for what the emissions factor is for a specific category? Generally, yes, there is a standard, and that standard is the EPA EEIO data set. If you're doing a spend-based analysis, there are a few other EEIO sources. As I mentioned, there are a handful for international factors, so they could come up with different numbers, but yeah, many of these types of tools are pulling from the same data set. And as I mentioned in my presentation, it's not about the math. The math is not the hard part. The hard part is being able to categorize your spending, group it properly, and then save and remember those spending patterns so that next year when you come back, you may only have to click one button and we can calculate a new emissions inventory for you, or a new purchase goods and services inventory for you. Let's see. Just looking through these questions here.
I can quickly answer the next
Sure.
question here.
Go for it.
From Christina, is the platform compatible with ERP systems such as NetSuite? So as I mentioned, the current version of it supports an Excel upload. So you could download out of NetSuite and then re-upload into our system. The spend integration that will automate that ingestion that I mentioned is compatible with NetSuite. We're working with a platform that will allow us to integrate with a variety of different accounting providers. So that includes Oracle NetSuite, QuickBooks, FreshBooks, Xero. Those are some examples of the systems that are compatible and will be supported with that integration.
Great. Let's see here. Looking at one question here. If I have purchases from Marriott from a low carbon eco lodge, those assigned to the same or different emission factors like accommodation per spent dollar or something different, and how? This is a great question because it does get to the reason why we want to be obtaining ultimately emissions data from our suppliers. If you're using a spend-based approach, it's not going to differentiate different products that are within the same commodity. So if you're using accommodation as your commodity, it's not going to differentiate between a low carbon eco lodge that you're staying at versus, a high rise hotel you might be staying at, which is why it's critical that this spend-based approach is not your final, is not your sort of, you're not just going to do the spend-based analysis and say you're done with purchase goods and services. That's what I really want to communicate is this is the first step. This is to make the process of obtaining emissions from your suppliers, from Marriott, for example, easier. So you can see that, my hotel emissions are, 25% of my purchase goods and services emissions. I need to connect with Marriott and get information on this. Or you might say, we spent a lot on hotels last year, but they're actually a really small percentage of our scope 3 emissions. I don't need to spend time on that. And then also just a technicality, hotels technically wouldn't fall under purchase goods and services, but it does work for the sake of example. So I hope that answers your question. We have a lot of, I'm just reading through more of these questions. Are spend-based emission factors more precise than other average data emission factors? If yes, and why? It actually really depends. So an example of another average data emission factor would be a generic LCA. So let's say that you are an apparel maker and you're buying fabric. The best case would be for your supplier to have done an LCA on their supply chain and their fabric, and they can provide you with a specific emission factor. If an average data emission factor would be that you find through some LCA software an emission factor for the fabric. Whether it's more accurate than spend-based is generally going to rely on what type of commodity we're talking about. If there's a lot of differentiation within that commodity, for example, as I was just discussing with accommodation, you can have, high-rise hotels, you can have resorts, you can have eco lodges. there's a wide spread. And so using an average data emission factor for hotels in that case may not be the most accurate way to do it. For fabric, it might be better because fabric is, it is a commodity that generally is the same between producers. So it really depends, I think, is the answer there. Yeah, so Vicky asks, can you include more information on how the tool helps with engaging with suppliers to obtain the primary data? What is included in the supplier assessment and questionnaire? A supplier assessment questionnaire actually spans a lot of different categories, more than just emissions. It asks about governance practices. It asks again about emissions targets, and then it also asks for allocated emissions. So it's a way for you to collect information more than just on your supplier's emissions. And it's a really nice automatic tool because you can bring in your suppliers and then just automatically send them a survey. You don't have to go through your email or anything. They'll get an email from Sustain.Life, and then they can report through our platform, and then it'll roll up the next time you log into your account. Elizabeth asks, can you describe again how the calculation works to edit the factors to incorporate inflation? Absolutely. So one thing is that the EEIO dataset analysis was performed on the 2018 US economy. And so one thing we need to do is all of the factors are in terms of 2018 US dollars. So we actually have to deflate. If you're inputting for, say, 2021, we actually have to deflate the spending so that it's in terms of 2018 dollars. We get those inflation numbers from the, I believe it's the Bureau for Labor Statistics. So we get it from the US government. Okay. I think we've covered sort of most of the major themes that I'm seeing in the questions. Jasmine, do you see anything else?
No, I think that covers most of it.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're very, very excited to be rolling out this tool, and we hope to see many of you in the application using it moving forward.
Great. Thank you, everyone.